Well, good morning and happy Renew Year to everyone. When I began working on this sermon series, it was by coincidence that someone asked me for advice. They asked me, how does someone trust God? How does someone put their faith in God? And I knew that person was looking for something like a process that if you did this, this, and this, bam, you get trust. If you do this, this, and this, you get faith. But I answered the question in hopes to change the perspective on what this person was asking. And I told that person to have trust or faith in God is not to ask how, but really this. What is holding you back? Before I continue, Laura, can you pull up my slides, please? Just go straight into my sermon. And so what was a coincidence became the impetus of this sermon series. That like our own New Year's resolutions, we have a tendency to repeat the same thing over and over again and go through the same process, and it becomes a vicious circle and difficult to break. And I showed everyone the same quote that Reverend Keith and Pastor David shared with us months ago. And I'll share it with you all again. Insanity is defined as doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. I hope that this year we try to not go through the same thing like we do with our New Year's resolutions, but try to renew our faith and journey with God. Thank you, Laura. It's okay. So if you look at the worship bulletin, you've probably already seen a whole bunch of things, but I've added a notes section. I know people were telling me that they're writing really tiny in the little margins and everything, so I tried to make space for you all to write today. And so the first set of fill-ins is a quick 5-word recap of last week. Let go and let God. Hoping that if we could just let go and let God take control of all of our obstacles we face in life, we can get out of these vicious cycles and be filled by God to do some amazing things. We can find better ways to improve our relationship with God and renew ourselves in our faith for this year. I challenged all of us to, including myself, to empty our own cups, to try to let go of the obstacles that impede us from trusting God more. And I wanted you to all to spend time this past week asking yourself this question: what are the things that I need to let go? Is it because that we already know and we already make assumptions about what we know about our God? Or are we holding too much pride to think we can go farther in our love for God? Are we too consumed by sadness and depression that even God couldn't pull us through? If you missed last week's sermon, you'll see on the back of your worship bulletin that there's a QR code and a little link if you wanted to watch it on YouTube after today's service. But I'm pretty sure if you ask really nicely, Steve over there in the corner can burn you a DVD copy to watch on your TV as well. But the point I wanted to make last week, that it is possible to let go. It's not easy. I'll be the first one to tell you that. And it may be a daily reminder of asking God to help us let go. And the beauty of a renewal is that God is always helping us to let go. Last week I used the story of Jesus washing the disciples' feet to make them clean. That God is trying to help us clear the obstacles out of our way from God's perspective so that we can get closer to Him. But I left the passage with Jesus saying this: "You do not know what I am doing, but later you will understand," hinting towards His demise of His death and resurrection. I want to finish the passage of Jesus washing the feet of the disciples And so here are excerpts from the passage continuing onward from verses 8 through 17. Peter said to him, "You will never wash my feet." Jesus answered, "Unless I wash you, you have no share with me." Simon Peter said to him, "Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head." Jesus said to him, "One who has bathed does not need to wash, except for the feet, but is entirely clean." He said to them, "Do you know what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have set you an example, that you also should do as I have done to you. Very truly I tell you, servants are not greater than their master, nor are the messengers greater than the one who sent them. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them." From today's reading, it was clear that the disciples didn't understand, because Simon Peter says two things in response very quickly. The first is this: "I will never let you wash my feet." Probably in protest that this is something that a slave would do, or what a disciple would do for their master, not what a master would do for their disciple. And the second statement, Peter responds with something I guess would be kind of logical, and with a boastful manner, asking Jesus to wash his hands and his head as well. The reality was that even Jesus' closest followers, whom he spent the most time with, didn't understand what he was doing at that moment, even after he responded. And yet, as we see in this passage, Jesus washed their feet to make them clean beyond their wildest imaginations. And as we see from the end, Jesus gave them two things: humility and an example to serve. And with the exception of Judas, the other 11 disciples followed in Jesus' footsteps to the very end of his ministry. And they continue to follow him to the very end of their own ministries. And if I was one of those 11 who saw the King of Kings scrubbing in between my own toes, I would recognize the life of Christ not only as a service to make people clean and whole, but to do it out of love. And this was done out of a love so infinite and so pure, I wouldn't know what to do with it unless I gave that love to someone else. I believe that's why this passage concludes with the words of Jesus saying, "He has set us an example to do what he has been doing to us." And knowing this, it is truly a blessing. If you remember from last week that the path of renewal begins with letting go, God will help us let go of the things we struggle with through a sense of example and service. That is also the same inspiration that God has set before us. And we begin to see the opportunities set in front of us. And that's the key. That's the key to being renewed in our faith. That when you feel the love of God, and when you're humbled by God's grace, it creates a desire to show the same love to others. And you begin to see the need to help others, and you want to be a part of that. And it's a chain reaction because, simply put, when we let go, all we want to do is just go. When we let go, all we want to do is just go. When we let go of what we're holding on to, God fills our cups with love and a desire to love others. There's no baggage that stands in our way. There's no obstacles you have to overcome. But in those moments where we find clarity and peace, God just asks us to go out into the world, to be fishers of humankind, to make disciples of all nations. And after Jesus was resurrected and sent out the disciples, they went forth into the world, leading their own ministries. as you may have read and studied the book of Acts, the disciples help us with this understanding of what it means to just go. I think for today, I wanted to actually give a little bit more guidance than just say, go read the book of Acts. But just give some guidance of what example and action Jesus wanted us to take. And so for your next fill-in, you'll see it is to just go in response. And for the disciples, they understood to just go in response. To go in response to God's call. The disciples followed Jesus' ministry, his teaching and his life, and then Jesus says in the Great Commission to go out and make disciples of all nations. If the disciples were called here, they went there. If they were forced to go somewhere, they set up their own ministries, and if they were asked to help, they helped. For many of you, I know you don't work here at this church, and yet the church recognizes all members of the congregation to be members or ministers of your own ministries. You have your own unique specialties and expertise and charm to connect to a specific group of people that may not be part of this congregation or part of any congregation. These are the ministries of your family, your workplace, your golfing buddies. These are the ministries that takes decades to cultivate or 5 minutes sitting next to them on a bus. You might call this evangelism, but I would rather call it an extension of God's grace from God through you to them. But in any case, this is the opportunity to go in response where God has called you. And the calling has held different descriptors, but the constant is always the same. Just go in response. But the next part is to just go in trust and faith. Because for the most part, I don't believe every disciple was well prepared for what was about to happen to them, but at least trusted in God that God would provide in every circumstance. And some of you may know that I actually went to Virginia as a chaplain intern for 10 weeks. And I promise you that every room that I walked into was a different experience. And I was caught off guard by one request from a patient. I just returned to her bedside to bring a Bible that she'd requested. And I handed the Bible to her, and she immediately gave it back to me and said, "Read." Now the patient was distraught and needed comfort from the Word. But she didn't know I only started working there for 2 weeks. And I wasn't prepared to give any passage for words of comfort for what she was going through. And she gave me that funny look and said, "Aren't you a pastor? Shouldn't you know these things?" So she handed me the Bible and said, "Read." And so I told her, "I will read right where you pointed." And so I read the passage. And when I was done, she was actually brought to tears because it touched her and the pain she was going through and gave her the answer she needed at that moment. To this day still, I will read that same exact passage and lift up a prayer to God, asking God for that same feeling that she felt. Not only the patient was touched by that moment, but the attending nurse who was there the entire time in the room was also touched and began to cry as well. Certainly, I would call this a moment where I was merely helping God reach this person. Didn't know how or what it would entail, but the full trust and faith that God would use me in that moment. The last fill-in that you'll see in your notes is pretty simple. Just go now. Many times we have an understanding that this is a great idea. Let's do it. But the timing's just not right. When the disciples were called by God, most of the time they didn't linger or hesitate on the action. But every time they didn't take the opportunity, they regretted it. And what I want to emphasize that aside from opportunity, we don't have forever to act upon the things that God has put in front of us. A good example was the opportunity for Simon Peter to say he knew Jesus, but denied him on 3 different accounts. And when the rooster crowed, he realized he missed his opportunity because the timing wasn't right. Please understand, I'm not talking about sacrificing intentionality or purpose. I'm talking about sacrificing vision and future and the ability for God to do something in that moment. Bob Goff, amazing person who wrote this book, Love Does, has this to say. It becomes clear that we need to stop plotting the course and instead just land the plane on our plans to make a difference by letting the do part, or by getting to the do part of our faith. That's because love is never stationary. In the end, love doesn't just keep thinking about it or keep planning for it. Simply put, love does. Love doesn't have an agenda or timing to it. It's not like you're waiting for a green light. The green light is given to you now. Let go and just go. Let God help you, inspire you, and use you. Go in response. Go in trust and faith. And go now. This is the example, fulfilled by God's love and poured out to us and overflowing into the world around us. Now, last week I told you I would share with you one of the things I have to continually let go in order to follow God. And for me, I have to let go of my comfort zone. I have to let go of being in a safe place, because if I stay in a safe place, I'll never grow. And I'll never see the world in its totality and its fullness. I have to let go of my fears and frustrations every single day in order to go out into the world and serve others. And every time I'm given an opportunity, I lift it up to God in prayer. Not to help me make that decision, but the strength to just go. To not hesitate, but just have trust that God will use me to the fullest. So with that, I want to leave you with a few questions to reflect on for this next week. The first one is this: what is God calling me to right now at this moment? Hopefully you'll have time to reflect on how we can respond to the moments where God is asking us to go, or the places where God wants us to do something. The second one is, how does God want me to show my love? To those around me. You may be the minister of your family or the minister of your workplace and not even realize it. But as set examples, we are still asked to show the same love that Jesus showed us. How do we help people let go of their own struggles? How do we help people become clean and free of obstacles so that they can get closer to God? The third is this: what am I waiting for? And if you can answer this question, there may be more things that you have to let go. Because if you remember what I said at the beginning of this message, it's not about how you trust God. It's about removing the things that stand in your way from trusting God. And if there's nothing standing in your way, you may not be waiting for anything. All you need to do is just go. Grace and peace to you all in your journey for 2014. And to not holding a resolution, but to be renewed by God this year. Amen.